So I think we are about to start our second event, the very first webinar we are hosting. So the webinar means we cannot see you. We can just read your names. We can also read your questions, which I would encourage you to pose even during the talk. And we will have a brief short Q&A after our talk. So let me welcome you all. My name is Ruth von Burnus. I'm the director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. I'm really very thrilled to host Daniela Weiner here tonight because she is a student I really met in her very first semester at UNC, and this year she graduated from UNC because she's currently the Jim Joseph postdoctoral fellow in the concentration in education and Jewish studies at Stanford University. And we hope very much that Daniela will be able actually to go to Stanford at one point and actually really be there. At the moment, it's more a virtual experience as far as I know. So as I've said, Daniela received her PhD in history, and she received also a graduate certificate in Jewish studies from UNC in 2020. Her current book project explores how the post-fascist countries of East Germany, West Germany, and Italy taught about the Second World War and the Holocaust in their educational systems. And as someone who grew up in East Germany, I can assure you this is really a very important and interesting topic. She has already published her research in the Journal of Modern Jewish Studies and Journal of Educational Media, Memory, and Society. She has received fellowship grants from the Fulbright US Student Program, the Georg Eckert Institute for International Textbook Research, the German Historical Institute, and the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. And last but not least, and thanks to many of you, from the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. So please let me welcome Daniela, and we are very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. I'm really very pleased to be here and sharing my research. If you just give me 1 second, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and then I'll go from there. So firstly, thank you so much to Ruth and Tina and Karen for organizing this and for inviting me here, or virtually here, to present my research. What I'm going to present today is a small part of a larger book project that I'm working on how the Holocaust and the Second World War were taught about in the post-war states of East Germany, West Germany, and Italy, as you heard from Ruth. Today, we're going to zoom in, pardon the pun, on a portion of this project. And of course, the research that I'm going to present today, while supported by a lot of different foundations, represents my own views. So, on an August 2020 episode of the late night show Last Week Tonight, comedian John Oliver pointed out that recent incidents of police brutality, as well as many politicians' responses to them, had underlined the need for better history education. Oliver then spent his show examining textbooks to see how the history of slavery and the Civil War had been taught historically in America. This impetus to re-examine history education in light of disturbing current events is not a new one. 60 years ago, and a continent away, a similar process had taken place. Now, when assessing the development of Holocaust education in West Germany, scholars have placed most attention on the post-1968 period. Indeed, most scholars who focus on the history of education in West Germany have characterized the period between the end of Allied occupation and the beginning of the 1968 student uprisings as one of restoration and stagnation. However, this idea of stagnation overlooks the very real and vital changes taking place during the late 1950s in West Germany. When a wave of anti-Semitic youth violence swept through West Germany in 1958 to 1960, a spotlight was turned on what students were actually learning about in school. Explicit teaching about the crimes of National Socialism was seen as a way of countering this phenomenon. Buffeted in the late 1950s by criticism by Jewish organizations, both domestic and international, the international Western press, and scholars and periodicals from the Eastern Bloc, the West German educational system was forced to make energetic strides towards recognizing West Germany's complicity in the Holocaust. Now, where did I find the information to support this argument? During the academic year 2018 to 2019, I lived in Germany on a Fulbright US student grant. During that time, I spent 2 weeks in Koblenz, a small city in Western Germany, which is famous for the Deutsche Ecke, German corner, where the Rhine and the Mosel rivers meet, as well as this castle, which you can see, I took the picture. And it's also home to the Federal Archive in Koblenz, where most of the documents from the former West Germany are stored, governmental documents. These documents include those of the West German Kultusministerkonferenz, or Standing Conference of the Ministers of Education and Cultural Affairs, or KMK. The KMK papers form the major source base of this presentation and reveal a new story about how the Holocaust education developed in the Federal Republic of Germany. They are also supplemented by examples of West German textbooks retrieved from the Georg Eckart Institute for International Textbook Research in Braunschweig, also in Germany, and examples of historical newspapers from the ProQuest Historical Newspaper Database. Now, before we go any further, it's worth briefly discussing how education was and continues to be governed in the Federal Republic of Germany. During the Cold War, the Federal Republic of Germany, or what we call West Germany, was made up of 10 states or Bundesländer. Education was a power delegated to the states, much as it is in the United States. But in the Federal Republic, there was and continues to be a guidance body made up of the representatives of all the states, the Kultusministerkonferenz. The KMK makes guidelines and made guidelines for curriculum and textbooks. And then the states then issued their own guidelines based on the KMK guidelines. And then each individual West German state had to approve a textbook before it could be used in its state schools. Teachers were allowed to pick which textbooks they wanted to use from an approved list. So there would be anywhere between 20 and 30 textbooks dealing with the subject of National Socialism, for example, on the market at any one time in West Germany. So with all that background, let's now turn to the so-called swastika wave of the late 1950s in West Germany and its educational repercussions. Anti-Semitic vandalism occurred with some frequency in West Germany in the 1950s, but seems to have attracted the attention of prominent German politicians, foreign governments, and World Jewish organizations in early 1959. It's unclear if the number or if the severity of anti-Semitic incidents appreciably increased, thus prompting this increased attention. But what is clear is that in December 1958, a number of newspapers in East Germany and other communist bloc states began to take fire at West German history textbooks' handling of the recent past. For example, a December 12, 1958 article from the East Berlin Nationalzeitung, or national newspaper, critiqued West Berlin school books for creating a deformed picture of history and accused West Berlin schools of indoctrinating children in fascist and Nazi ideas. For the most part, these articles focused primarily on supposed revanchist and neo-fascist rhetoric in West German textbooks, and did not touch upon West German textbooks' handling of the murder of the Jews. The exception to this trend was an extraordinarily long critique of West German textbooks published by a Polish news agency, which critiqued, among other books, a West German school atlas. According to this article from the Polish news agency, the school atlas presented a misleading depiction of what German textbooks called at the time the final solution, which underplayed the number of Jewish victims of the Nazis. West Germans, or at least West Germans who were employed in areas concerning education, clearly took note of these critiques. And how do I know this? because when I went into the KMK files, I found them cut out and put in the files. So clearly they were collecting these newspaper articles and felt them important enough to hold on to them. Non-German Western observers also seem to have picked up on the critiques, or perhaps were just making some of their own. The British magazine Common Ground published an article around the same time criticizing German history textbooks for what they perceived to be a rehabilitation of Hitler and a questioning of whether or not the concentration camp system had existed. The publication of this article prompted a 1959 investigation by the United Kingdom-based Anglo-Jewish Association. American Jewish organizations also expressed concern. Every year, the American Jewish Committee published the American Jewish Yearbook, which, among other things, reported on the conditions of Jews around the world, as well as on political and cultural developments that would be of interest to American Jews in particular. The 1959 edition of the American Jewish Yearbook talked about the textbooks and said that education about the Nazi past was insufficient, and disparagingly said that the textbooks were not covering the topic thoroughly or well. But the issue was not just being raised internationally. West German television and print journalists lobbed their own criticisms as well. So there was this thing in the late 1950s called television magazines, and the television magazine Blick in die Zeit, a look at our times, featured in January 1959 a concentration camp survivor named Eugen Kogen, asking West German high school students about National Socialism. And then this was followed by the broadcast in April 1959 of the documentary Blick auf unsere Jugend, die Schule und Hitler, Focus on Our Youth, the Students and Hitler, which was broadcast on the public broadcasting network for the federal state of Hessen, Hessische Rundfunk. The filmmaker who made this documentary, Jürgen Neven-Dumont, exposed the ignorance of West German students and found that in a class of 33 gymnasium students, so in West Germany, this is the highest tier of schools, so presumably the most educated students, in a class of 33 gymnasium students, only 13 said that they knew how many Jews had been killed under National Socialism, and only 9 presented what Dumont considered reasonably accurate responses. Around the same time, Theodor Heuss, the federal president of West Germany, received representatives from the German Coordinating Council for Christian-Jewish Cooperation, and also a representative of a larger American Jewish organization who's not identified in the papers, but doing a little bit of digging. I figured it's probably a man named Zachariah Schuster, who was European director of the American Jewish Committee at the time. So both the Coordinating Council representatives and Schuster, or the man who likely was Schuster, wished to talk with Heuss about incidents of anti-Semitism that were taking place in West Germany in 1959, which they felt were linked to deficiencies in the educational system. As a result of these meetings, Heuss wrote to the KMK president asking that the KMK consider these issues at their very next meeting. Real attention had to be given to the problem at hand. Pushed into action, the KMK began devoting a number of its meetings to issues of contemporary history and of representations of National Socialism in history textbooks. The first meeting of note was an April 23rd, 24th, 1959 plenary meeting of the KMK, which evaluated treatment of what they called, quote, current events in history and German education. And this was probably the meeting that Heuss had specifically requested, but it didn't just stop there. The KMK and its subsidiary school committee thereafter regularly considered this and related issues in 1959 and 1960 and 1961 and 1962. I read all their meeting minutes. There were a lot of them, but they talked about it a lot. And work also began on the federal state level, where they started creating new decrees, each state, and also started looking at their history textbooks. They assigned evaluators to go through and look at how the textbooks being used in those particular states were depicting National Socialism. Now, the KMK issued a number of resolutions, some apparently for internal use, but others to be distributed nationally. The first major public policy statement put forth by the KMK on the issue was a 1960 binding resolution on what was called, quote, handling of the most recent history in history and social studies instruction, end quote. The 1960 resolution began somewhat defensively by noting the long history of the KMK's engagement with political education, long before what was called the, quote, particular incidents of the past year, end quote. The resolution was overarching, discussing many topics, including teacher training, the appropriate relationship between teachers and students, and also school books. The resolution noted that textbook review would continue and advice for the evaluation and improvement of school books would be given directly to publishing houses. Another resolution, Guidelines for the Handling of Totalitarianism in Instruction, was put forth in 1962. Now, in February 1960, when this first resolution was released, the KMK had already been working on this issue for a year, but the timing of this public resolution was particularly important due to events that had happened a month and a half earlier. A wave of anti-Semitic defacement, or what is known as the swastika wave, through West Germany and the world had begun after two neo-Nazis had vandalized the newly rebuilt Cologne synagogue on Christmas Day, 1959. These incidents sharpened both domestic and international attention on West Germany's educational practices surrounding the most recent history, as they called it, and prompted a number of press inquiries from Western foreign papers about the state of history education and history textbooks. If the frequent international coverage, some of it painstakingly clipped out and placed in the KMK files, did not alert West German cultural ministers and ministries that the world was watching, direct communication from the West German Foreign Office definitely did. The West German Foreign Office sent a telegram to the KMK on the day of their meeting when they were going to consider the 1960 resolution. Although apparently the telegram wasn't received until after they had met, the West German Foreign Office clearly had intended to affect the outcome of that meeting because the telegram noted that the British foreign minister had requested information and materials on the anti-Semitic acts taking place in West Germany at the time for an upcoming talk that he was going to give at the House of Commons. The British foreign minister had particularly requested to see examples of school books. The West German Foreign Office telegram closed with the line, quote, "I would be thankful if the above mentioned foreign policy point of view with reference to the composition of German history school books could be kept in mind," end quote. So, how successful were these efforts by the KMK? One way to answer this question is to look at the textbooks themselves. Under this immense amount of pressure from various sides, we begin to see some massive changes in how the textbooks from this period discuss what we now know as the Holocaust, particularly if one considers the few short years between the mid-1950s and the early 1960s. And when I say what we now know as the Holocaust, it's because they were not using the term at the time. For example, the popular West German textbook Kletsgeschichtliches Unterrichtswerk underwent huge changes in how it described the Holocaust between the 1956 edition of Ausgabe, or version B, and the 1960 edition. If we look, for example, at the terror and crimes subsection, which discussed the Nazi T4 program, as well as Nazi crimes against the Jews, the word count of the section increased hugely between the 1959 and 1960 editions. Word count, however, is just one metric, and in my larger project, I also look at how the content of these books changed, but just for the purpose of time, I'm just showing you the word count today. That said, this was an ambivalent success. Even if the textbooks were massively revised, not all the teachers implemented the new curricular guidelines correctly, and not all students found that the KMK recommendations had a democratic anti-fascist effect as the KMK had intended. For example, Judith Jago-Jung, born in 1946, whose father was of Jewish ancestry, and her father was imprisoned in a labor camp between 1943 and 1945. Judith Jago-Jung published this in her memoir in the 1980s and said, "My teachers simply avoided the subject because they themselves were too directly implicated in the events. For them, history books ended in 1933. In history class, we would spend half a year treating the Weimar Republic in detail, only to end up racing through modern history from 1933 to 1945 with a kind of vague nostalgia in the last class before summer vacation. After the vacation, it was Konrad Adenauer and the post-war miracle." Yet, even if teachers were not yet ready to make use of the new educational materials, some curious children were able to get their hands on them and to start to learn about the horrors of the Third Reich on their own. Sabine Reichel, also born in 1946, recalled in her memoir, quote, "And then there was an extra chapter, about 3/4 of a page long. It was entitled The Extermination of the Jews, and I had read it in my room at home many times. I always locked the door because I didn't want anyone to know what I was reading. 6 million Jews were killed in concentration camps. And as I read about Auschwitz and the gas chambers, a wave of feelings, fearful fascination mingled with disgust rushed over me. But I kept quiet. What cruel monsters must have existed then? I was glad that it had all happened in the past and that the cruel Germans were gone, because as the book pointed out, the ones responsible were punished. I couldn't help feeling alarmed by something I couldn't put my finger on. How could so many innocent people be murdered? We never read that particular chapter aloud with our teacher as we did so many other ones." End quote. Now, regardless of whether or not the teachers used these new educational materials, they clearly still made their way into some students' hands and evoked serious questions, prompting self-reflection about this fascist past, which may very well have had very large societal effects going forward, especially when we think about the student revolts of 1968. While some scholars have argued that the student revolts of 1968 began a new attention on Holocaust education and teaching about the Nazi past, I would argue that the educational reforms of the late 1950s and early 1960s, in fact, drove some of the rhetoric of the student protests. The West German university students of 1968 who talked of Auschwitz and accused the older generation of being Nazis were middle schoolers during the late 1950s and early 1960s and would have been exposed to this new generation of textbooks that we just discussed. Therefore, in conclusion, long before the student revolts of 1968, textbook writers and education officials in West Germany became concerned about what was being taught in schools about National Socialism. A veritable revolution in the curriculum, therefore, took place in the early 1960s. Contemporary history became increasingly valued by the school systems, although not always by the individual school teachers. The textbooks were rewritten to begin dealing with the Nazi fascist crimes. The resulting textbooks were still highly problematic, as we saw in the Reichel quote. However, one cannot deny that some sincere soul searching took place during these years about how to present a problematic past. This research has been funded by the following sources, and I really thank you very much for your time and your attention today. These are my contact details.
Thank you, Daniela. And I have already a couple of questions, and I encourage everyone to put the questions, or at least put in a line that you have a question. I can't even give you, unmute you. I think that's the power of the moderator. So Rebecca Collins had a question very early on, and she said, she asked, "I don't know how true it is, but I heard that Nazi language is illegal in Germany, or at least brings penal consequences. If true, why has white nationalism been able to rise again in Germany?"
That is a very good question. I'm not sure if I have an answer, however. Yes, Holocaust denial, I believe, is illegal. But why has white nationalism been able to rise? I don't know if I have a very good answer to that question. I'm sorry.
Bruce has another question. I'll see if I can actually give him. Bruce, I put you on speaker. And can you ask your question?
Sure. I just wanted to know if all of the 10 West German states had reasonably similar deficits in the teaching materials prior to 1960, or if any specific states stood out as being particularly problematic. And likewise, after 1960 and the attempt to rectify that, the deficit, did any of the states stand out again, or were they all sort of roughly equivalent?
That's a very good question. So the way I focused my research is I started by looking at the textbooks. The project really started with the textbooks. And what I wanted to do was pick textbook series that were used throughout in various different federal states that were widely used. And so I didn't focus so much on the outliers. I will say that there were certain federal states that did very well in addressing these issues going forward after the 1960 resolutions and into the 60s and the 70s, because my project goes forward from there. For example, the state of Lower Saxony, where the Eckart Institute is based, so they have a lot of material from Lower Saxony. But they were, for example, there was I don't remember exactly which Jewish organization, but I remember there was a Jewish organization that sent a letter to the KMK in the 70s saying, Lower Saxony is doing this very well. Everyone should look at what Lower Saxony is doing. So there were certain federal states that did particularly well in explicit teaching about the Holocaust and explicit teaching about crimes. There were certain federal states that took the lead in making sure that their school children were taken to concentration camp memorial sites. For example, Bavaria has been from the the 60s, I believe, started encouraging visits to concentration camp memorials. And so there is obviously some regional and differences, but I would say before the late 1950s, the deficiencies were largely across the board.
Okay, and now we have so many questions pouring in, so we'll cover a lot. So Adele, could you pose your question? You are unmuted. Otherwise, I'll just read the question. Has the perception of the inclusion of this material in the curricula changed over time?
The perception of the inclusion of this material in terms of have scholars decided that they've done well?
No,
in the curricular.
Oh. In general. Mostly in general and in the public. I've had an unusual circumstance where I've met two young Germans, and they're probably in their early 20s now. And they're open-minded, liberal, travel the world, and they're questioning the cost of this material versus the history of Germany overall.
Well, I know that my study is primarily historical. I cut myself off between 1989 and 2000, depending on how I'm feeling that day. But what I will say is there has been some news coverage in the last 10 years about young Germans saying that they felt that there was too much now Holocaust education, that the pendulum had gone the other way, and that they felt that it was too much. Now, this may be some people holding different ideologies, but I know that I think up until a certain point, there was a push from the 1960s onward. We need to talk about this more. We need to talk about this more. We need to be more self-critical. And then now there is some feeling in the media that that there is so much Holocaust education going on in Germany. Although in many ways, Germany is an example about how to deal with a painful past and how to teach about it.
And I think Leonard Rogoff has a wonderful question, which brings us back to your time period. So Leonard, I put you on. Oops. So we don't hear you, so I'll read the question. The change in education. Oh, okay, now you're on.
Now I'm unmuted. Yes, I just noticed that the transformation of Holocaust education in Germany coincided with the era of the Eichmann capture, trial, and execution, which is usually regarded as a transformational moment in American consciousness of the Holocaust. I was wondering what the impact was on the German's educational curriculum.
No, you're absolutely right. And in many studies about West German Holocaust memory and really all Holocaust memory in Europe, people point to the Eichmann trial as a very important point. It was televised, people watched it, people talked about it in the newspaper. I did actually find some mention about how to, I believe I found some mention of the Eichmann trial in the papers of the KMK. But I guess part of my argument is they were actually talking about it before. So the Eichmann trials in 1961, but the West Germans were trying to grapple with this from late 58 onward. But I absolutely agree that certainly, the Eichmann trial certainly catalyzed efforts going forward to deal with the Nazi past in West German schools.
And there's a sort of a follow-up question from Audrey. Who said and asked, do any of the student leaders discuss their educations in terms of their ideologies?
I have not come across it, but I would love to come across it in the sources. I'm still looking a little bit there. In terms of my conclusion that it could have had a causative effect on some of the rhetoric going on in 68, I haven't found anyone directly saying, yes, I learned about it in school and now I'm applying it here. But a part of me thinks these students were in middle school when these new curriculum were being brought out, when these new textbooks were being brought out. Certainly it must have had an effect. We have memoirs that people say they read the books, the new books, and we know that in 68 people are using this rhetoric. So I think there must be a connection there, although I have not yet found someone who said, yes, it was definitely my middle school experience that brought me here.
And Max, you had actually several questions and you're on the air right now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. First of all, great talk, Danielle. Thanks so much for sharing it with us. So I have two questions. The first one I'm going to start with is that the new textbooks that come about at the end of the 50s, I'm curious about what they say about the longer history of anti-Semitism in Germany. You mentioned that really great, vivid quote from that student about how that section that she would read at home about the Holocaust made it seem as if this was just some kind of, unique feature of an alien kind of Nazi regime. Did these textbooks that existed during this period talk at all about earlier instances of anti-Semitism? Like, would this come up when they were talking about the Weimar Republic? And then a second question is that, when I hear what you're saying about textbooks, I can't help but think about a lot of what goes on in this country right now, that we have this kind of new situation of memory wars that play out with certain textbook revisions. We can think about what's happened recently with the 1619 Project from the New York Times. And I'm just curious, was there any kind of political backlash to the introduction of textbooks that talked more openly about what would subsequently be referred to as the Holocaust in the late 50s, early 60s?
Let me address, I think, your second question and then go back to your first. So your second question is, was there any backlash? I did not see any, but that may have also been from where I was looking. So I was looking at primarily the educational ministry's papers at the Bundesarchiv Koblenz, but I didn't actually see anyone submitting any protests. Really, most people seemed very positive, or at least the people who were submitting to the ministries at this point, things or petitions, most people were pushing for more education. So I didn't actually see any backlash, although it would be something to look at going forward. Max, could you remind me of your first question though?
Sure. I may not have phrased it all too well. The first one was just, how do these textbooks deal with larger, issues of anti-Semitism in German society, culture, and history? Is it something that is just put forward as some kind of strange feature of the Nazi regime, or is there any discussion of it existing before the Nazis come to power?
So I looked primarily, when I was analyzing these textbooks, just because of the huge number of textbooks I looked at, I looked primarily just at the sections that address Nazi Germany, with a little bit of like the Nazis' rise to power through Weimar, through the Weimar Republic. I will say that it did not, at least in the early textbooks, you don't see the history of anti-Semitism addressed really. As you get into later textbooks from really the 90s, you start to see textbooks with a discussion about the history of Jews in Germany, the history of anti-Semitism in Germany, a much fuller context. But in these early textbooks in the 50s and the 60s, it is, while not explicitly said this was an aberration, what happened, it's certainly treated that way. The larger history of anti-Semitism is not really addressed.
Okay, thanks so much.
No problem. Thanks for your questions.
So thank you, Daniela. I think there were two more questions which are sort of show that we probably need to continue the discussion about textbooks. One was about what is currently taught, and you said already that you're not doing research on current textbooks, but I think this might be a good topic for another one. And then there is definitely, so there was a question about East Germany, which I think would be another talk, and I hope we can have another talk and continue this conversation. So thank you so much. Again, thank you everyone who came to this evening talk. We hope to see you at our next event. We will send out the information again here. And if you're not on our mailing list, you can sign up on our mailing list. Again, Daniela, thank you so much. And good luck with your real start in Stanford.
Thank you.